And then there were two. Hawaii first, and now Maryland has joined in to just say no to Travel Ban 2.0. But how many roast pigs do you need at a luau, especially when the pig is Donald Trump? Hi, everyone, and welcome to what we like to call Emil Amok's Takeout. We serve it, you take it out. My takes on all things about race, society, politics, and diversity, and everything those things touch in our culture and society with respect to Asian Americans. Of course, you don't have to be Asian American to lend us your ears. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host, and you might say, why Amok? Well, the short story is that for nearly 15 years, my Emil Amok column was a staple of Asian Week, what was once the leading Asian American weekly in English in America. Amok was the name of my compilation of essays. Amok is on my driver's license, but that is not a description of my mental state. And on this episode, we find ourselves cheering on Hawaii, and as I said, now Maryland has joined in. Hawaii, where an Asian American judge in the nation's most Asian American state has spoken for all of us. Maryland piled in later on or earlier today, but the effect is the same. Trump's revised travel ban is dead until Trump can revive it with some legal mouth-to-mouth. Now, there's an image for you. I will admit that I wasn't sure that Islamophobia was going to be beaten back and stopped this time around. I mean, even Trump acknowledged, hey, this is my watered-down version, he said yesterday in Nashville. And when he signed Travel Ban 2.0 as Executive Order 13780 on March 6th, well, it appeared to be fairly sanitized from the most obviously unconstitutional elements that stopped Travel Ban 1.0, which remains stymied by the courts. I mean, it was even kind of nice in a way, in a sense. I mean, it had provisions to allow for certain business and family travel and the possibility of waivers, although no real details about that. Waivers was a word used and written into that order. And yet, as we pointed out and others have pointed out, a travel ban is still a travel ban when you're banning 6 majority Muslim nations, and it still appeared to be a violation of the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, which, of course, prohibits laws on a religious basis. The government's lawyers, Trump's lawyers, tried to make it all smell legal enough, but it turns out it just wasn't as fragrant as Hawaiian plumeria. Oh, you know plumeria smells nice. Hibiscus, hibiscus don't smell, but plumeria smells nice. And a whole lot better than the Trump travel ban. With just hours before 2.0 was set to take effect, federal judge Derek Kahala Watson, an Asian American federal judge in Honolulu, halted the ban nationwide by issuing that temporary restraining order. And if you go to aldef.org/blog, there's a link there to the order. You could read it yourself, but it granted that TRO to the state of Hawaii and to Ismail El-Sheikh. Now, you probably heard a lot about Hawaii in the reports, but not much about El-Sheikh in most of the news reports. And to me, he was an important issue to the lawsuit. I mean, Hawaii essentially based their claim similar to Washington's. It was going to hurt the university system. It was going to hurt the economy, especially the tourism in Hawaii. But it was the presence of El-Sheikh that really, I think, made the difference. He was the human face. I mean, consider his his story, which was all over the decision of the judge, where Ilshik, the Imam of the Muslim Association of Hawaii, and a community leader, his wife, 5 kids, all of them U.S. citizens, and yet it was his appeal for his mother-in-law, which really propelled his legal standing. His mother-in-law last visited in 2005, did not have a visa. The family applied in 2015 for her to visit. In January of 2017, they were told that the visa had been put on hold because of the first travel ban. And then when the second travel ban was announced, Ilshik feared that his mother-in-law would be barred from entry unless she was granted a waiver, which was not really detailed in the executive order. The possibility of a waiver existed, but certainly just that possibility did not invalidate his claims, according to the judge. And the judge said that Dr. Ilshik, who's a PhD, had standing to assert his claims, including an Establishment Clause violation. So you can read my piece on the ALDEF blog at aaldef.org/blog. But there's the harm, the human harm. You know, we see these things that people can argue theoretically, oh, well, you know, the state and the universities and, you know, they'll be hurt and there's going to be damages there and injury. But here's the personal approach in Hawaii, right? The Ohana approach, the family approach. And Ilshik is quoted as saying that his children are affected by the travel ban. They don't understand what's happening. They feel hurt. And that the family would be devastated. Of course, that's the aloha spirit, the Ohana spirit in Hawaii. But Trump, speaking in Nashville, when he heard about the decision, railed out that, hey, this is my watered-down version and it failed. Well, we should have done what I was going to do before and take it to the Supreme Court, which he may do, saying that this was an example of judicial overreach. What got me about Trump's comments is that he said it made us look weak. I beg to differ. Fighting Islamophobia makes us appear much stronger than President Trump will even know. I mean, there was this key point that the judge wrote in his decision, you know, that, just exposing the pretext of the government's claim. The government said that the executive order was not religiously motivated because, quote, the 6 countries represent only a small fraction of the world's 50 Muslim majority nations and covers every national, meaning every person of those countries, including millions of non-Muslim individuals. But the judge saw through that. The Judge Watson wrote, the illogic of the government's contentions is palpable. The notion that one can demonstrate animus toward any group of people only by targeting all of them at once is fundamentally flawed. See, you don't have to target all of them to show your hatred. You can show your hatred against this one. That's all it takes. The judge saw it, but it did expose Trump's strained attempt to justify his xenophobic outrage. So we tip our hats to the state of Hawaii, to the judge, and to Ismail Ilshik. All it took was standing up to the bully. Standing up, which we must continue to do. So the question remains, what is the government going to do now? Trump says he's going to take it to the Supreme Court. But I just think after 2 strikes, the administration And after this watered-down version gets rejected, maybe the administration will learn it's time to tone down the rhetoric. If they want to stop terrorism, maybe begin by toning down that rhetoric. And I mention this because if you've been reading our blogs at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund at aldef.org/blog, in the previous one we wrote about that SALT report, the South Asian Americans Leading Together, their report on hate violence. It's pretty startling. In 1 year, 207 incidents of hate violence and xenophobic political rhetoric directed at South Asian, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Middle Eastern, and Arab communities here in our country. And that makes it a 34% increase in less than a third of the time covered in SALT's 2014 report. It's a serious thing. The reports break down 140 incidents of hate violence, plus 67 incidents of xenophobic political rhetoric, of which 95% were motivated by anti-Muslim sentiment. And of course, 1 in 5 instances of the rhetoric came from, who else? The Donald. Now, the report acknowledges that maybe the threshold of a hate crime may be lower than that of the legal definition, but it points out that even the 2015 hate crime statistics show a 7% increase in hate crimes overall. We're talking about the official hate crime stats, and that includes a whopping 67% increase in hate crimes against Muslims. So you take it all as a whole, and it really paints a full picture of the xenophobia our communities face, according to the report. And you can't help but also think about the situation of Srinivas Kuchibhotla, the man who was shot and killed in Olathe, Kansas, after just hanging out with his friend, having a whiskey, and then being gunned down by a man who reportedly said, "Get out of my country." Well, they got the perp, Adam Purinton, and we write about his background. But I don't think he can go over the Kuchibhotla case and how he was killed, because, in fact, if we don't talk about it, people will forget. And already people are saying, hey, is this like Vincent Chin? I go over that in my blog post, how it's not exactly, but it is. So read it there. I wanted to mention it again because it seems like the hate crimes, the travel ban story, it really goes hand in hand. It's all about Islamophobia and the effect of the rhetoric on our society. People are getting hurt. Time to tone it down in terms of the administration's rhetoric. It's not working. You want to fight terrorism, you don't start terrorism at home first. So, on our podcast today, I wanted to play an interview that I did. I conducted this several weeks ago, right after the Kuchibhotla story broke. I talked to a Chinese American's early reaction to the case, and it really shows how Islamophobia affects us all. I've always said I want in this podcast to showcase different voices in our community, and Jenn Fang is one of those voices who runs the website reappropriate.co, that's .co. She was following the case from the very beginning, and here's our interview recorded a week just after the incident, and it shows why all Asian Americans should be concerned by Kuchibhotla's death and the alarming trend that death appears to be a part of. Jenn Fang is the writer behind one of the most important blogs in Asian America from the standpoint of feminism and racial activism. It's called reappropriate.co. Welcome, Jenn, to The Takeout. I've been reading your blog for a long time. How long have you been doing it?
Thank you very much for having me. So, Reappropriate, I've started the blog in about late 2001, early 2002, so I've been doing it for almost 16 years now. I started as a college student as a space for me to sort of develop my own activism and my own political consciousness, and I thought I would share that space with the rest of the online Asian American blogosphere.
Yeah, now, why reappropriate? Because, that doesn't sound very Asian, some people who might be new to your blog might say.
Yeah, I chose the name Reappropriate because, to me, I think one of the core issues for the Asian American community is that we have been defined from outside the community when it comes to our stories, our politics, who we are, even how we think about ourselves, through racism and stereotypes. And for many Asian Americans, we haven't had an opportunity to sort of claim our voice and to claim our stories and claim our history. And so I named my blog Reappropriate as a sort of call to action to have Asian Americans do just that, to reappropriate our voices and our history.
Well, it's as I said, an important blog. I check into it every now and then, and you're writing about a big story right now, or you had a little post about the Olathe incident, or what Trump 45 called the shooting in Kansas City. He mentioned it in his speech the other night, the joint address before Congress. Were you bothered at all that he called it the shooting in Kansas City and didn't even bother to go into why it was a hate crime?
Absolutely. I was very bothered by the way the current president devoted exactly, I believe, 5 words to the shooting last week in Olathe. And he didn't, for those who didn't know what was going on, he didn't contextualize what had happened. He didn't contextualize why we should be concerned about the fact that a man had been shot and killed in Olathe. He didn't even bother to get the geography of the incident straight. And this also came a full 6 days after the attack in Olathe. And this is an incorrigible and unforgivable amount of time for a president to wait to comment on an incident of such heinous and serious and grave nature. Well,
for people who still aren't up with the story, it goes like this. It's 2 Indian men in a bar. Srinivas Kuchibotla, who's 32, and Alok Madasani, and also 32 years old. They both worked at Garmin, which is in the Kansas City area. Garmin, the GPS firm that hardly anyone I know uses, but they hire these tech workers from India, and they're there in Kansas City. They're in a bar. 51-year-old Adam Purinton sees them, yells out, the witnesses say he yelled out, "Get out of my country." I don't even think he knew who he was referring to, what race or ethnicity. He just saw them as foreigners. So it's almost a pure case of xenophobia. He had a gun. He shot the 2 men, killing Kuchibotla. When you first heard the story, what was because I first heard it only when the New York Times reported it on Saturday. But when you first heard it, what was your reaction to the whole thing?
I was outraged. I was sort of devastated that this had happened. As far as I'm concerned, the details as they emerged, and I learned about the story the very next day. So pretty much as soon as it was happening in Kansas City media was when I started following the story. So I was able to follow the story as details were emerging on Thursday. And as the details were emerging, it became more and more clear to me, more and more evident that this was sort of a textbook hate crime as far as I was concerned. The details that emerged was that Purinton, when he first saw Srinivas Kuchibotla and Alok Madasani, he profiled them and made assumptions about them based on the color of their skin. He saw how they looked and assumed that they were foreigners, that they were immigrants, and not only that they were illegal immigrants. So eyewitnesses later recount that he approached them basically without any sort of provocation and started demanding to know what visas they were on in the country and accusing them of being illegally in the country. And that was sort of what prompted him to come back later and to commit violence against them. So that contextualizes his statement that many eyewitnesses have corroborated, that he yelled out, "Get out of my country," before he started shooting. Another aspect of this that I think is very important is that he didn't, as you said, he didn't stop to check to see what ethnicity they were. He assumed that they were Middle Eastern, and that we can verify by the fact that after he escaped the scene of the attack, he drove 70 miles south. It took him about 5 hours to escape police. And when he confessed in an Applebee's bar sometime after midnight, he told the bartender that he needed to hide out because he thought he had shot and killed 2 Iranians. So he clearly had made a lot of racist assumptions based entirely on the color of the skin of his victims. To me, that is a textbook definition of a racial hate crime.
To me, it just seems like we've been down this path before.
Absolutely. We've been down this path as people of color and as Asian Americans for decades. There are lots of people who are likening this crime to what happened to Vincent Chin in 1982, when he was the victim of a hate crime because he was mistaken. He was a Chinese American
Right.
man who was mistaken as Japanese American. Before I think we make that parallel, I also want to make a quick parallel. I think it's very important to note that this is something that happened to someone who is South Asian American, or what happened last week in Olathe was something that happened to 2 South Asian Americans. And so we're talking about Islamophobia having become racialized and has become synonymous with brown skin. And it becomes less important to the racists what the ethnic identity of the person that they're being racist towards actually is. Instead, the brown skin has become a signifier of otherness and foreignness and mistaken identity for Islamic faith. And so one thing that I just really quickly want to parallel what happened last week in Olathe to what happened to Balbir Singh Sodhi. So Balbir Singh Sodhi was the first incident of a hate crime that occurred right after 9/11. And Mr. Sodhi was a gas station attendant in Phoenix, Arizona, who was shot and killed purportedly as revenge for the 9/11 attacks. Now, he was a Sikh American. He wasn't Muslim or Middle Eastern, and yet he was mistaken because of the articles of his faith for being related to the 9/11 attackers. And the fact is that since 9/11, Islamophobic hate crimes have increased by 1,600% in the last decade and a half. And not only are those hate crimes that have targeted Muslims and Muslim Americans for violence, but also anyone that a racist is mistaking for Muslim or Muslim American. And too often that includes South Asian Americans, Indian Americans, Sikh Americans, and Asian American Muslims who are within our community. So Islamophobia is something that matters to Asian Americans.
Yeah, it's almost as if it's become so generalized now. We've gone away from Islamophobia. We're just into the otherness, into you're not from this country. Get out. This is a coincidence. I have an in-law relative who adopted a young Asian child. They've been raising her now for some time, and they live in Kansas. They were trying to get her a driver's permit, and you wouldn't believe the amount of bureaucracy they had to go through to prove that this child, who is an adoptee from Asia, was their child. They wanted to see birth records, and I just think this is what's happening it's happening in Middle America in the same way that some people didn't realize what was going on during the election with, in Middle America. This is more of that, or at least that's what it appears like to me. How about to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's happened is xenophobia has sort of come to the forefront of our politics and come to the forefront of our culture wars. And folks who are not white have become marked, I think, within the mindset of some Americans or some people as being not American, as if we don't belong based solely on the color of our skin. And that kind of nativism and xenophobia is not a new phenomenon, unfortunately, in America. I think that American history contains several examples of folks being the victims of oppression and violence, because starting from the logic that who we are means we do not belong.
Yeah, your reaction, I noticed over the weekend on Twitter, you were pretty upset that, not just the coverage, although the Times story did appear on Saturday morning, you were pretty amazed that there was no outcry from anybody. It was like just a local story. But I'm sure in your mind, this wasn't just a local story.
Absolutely not. I think this is symbolic of how xenophobia and nativism is becoming a real and legitimate threat to people of color in America. To me, this is one of a pattern of violent acts against people of color that have been rising in Trump's America, in response to political rhetoric that has whipped up this kind of nativist hysteria. I was just reading in the Southern Poverty Law Center release earlier today that was trying to contextualize what happened in Olathe, was pointing out that the state Republican Party had, in the weeks prior to the presidential election last year, had sent mailers to Kansas residents and Kansas City residents that were explicitly Islamophobic, that were trying to set up an us versus them mentality in, Kansas residents versus ISIS. And we're using sort of stereotypical imagery of Islamic terrorists and trying to create fear of a sort of like invading horde of non-white people into Kansas in order to try and whip up support for the local Republican Party. This wasn't some sort of fringe political group. This was the Kansas State Republican Party sending these kinds of blatantly racialized mailers to Kansas and Kansas City residents and voters. So this Olathe thing doesn't happen in a political vacuum.
Well, we know that xenophobia, the Olathe thing or xenophobia, it is encouraged and it's whipped up by multi-million-dollar campaigns by legitimate organizations. I mean, we know that for a fact. And whether or not, and this was one of my concerns. I was hesitant when I first heard the story on Saturday to see if there really was a link between either Trump rhetoric or the era of Trump. But I think now, especially since the FBI came out and said, yes, we're going to look at it as a hate crime on Tuesday of this week, at the same time that, President, Trump 45 said, yeah, this won't be tolerated, even though he didn't say much about what he's what he's railing out against.
So I think that one thing we have to do to start to push back against these kinds of xenophobic and nativist rhetoric is to point out the connection between when a politician uses xenophobia on the campaign trail and these kinds of attacks. I think that there's sort of an instinct, and I think a valid one, to be cautious when something like this first happens. What a hate crime is carries with it a very strict legal definition, and we live in a country where people are innocent until proven guilty. And so it is important, I think, to collect details and to be careful when we start talking about things as potential hate crimes. We need to make sure that we have good reason to do that, to start talking about this as a potential hate crime. But I think as the details emerge and it becomes clearer and clearer that hate played a factor in crimes such as these, I think it's very important to start to connect these instances of hate and violence to a larger political climate where xenophobia and nativism have been normalized by what is being said on the campaign trail by our political leaders. And so I think it's important for folks like you and me to do the work of trying to connect something that Trump is saying in some of his speeches before and after he got elected, trying to whip up Islamophobia and nativism and xenophobia, and say that has real consequences on real people living on the ground in Middle America, for example, as what happened last week. This isn't an isolated incident. This is part of a larger pattern, and if we don't push back against this, these kinds of incidents will continue to happen.
And it also includes the anti-Semitic instances that have happened, the rise just since Trump was elected. And one of the things that has been pointed out is, just this week, a hate crime law in Indiana couldn't get out of the legislature there. And there are no hate crime laws in Kansas. So if this becomes a hate crime, and some people say, a crime against humanity is a crime, but hate crime brings special enhancements. But if it does happen in this case, it's going to have to be a federal thing, and so we're going to have to see. So Trump and Attorney General Sessions, if he's still Attorney General, will have a hand on this. He may not have a hand on whether or not the Trump administration talked to or Trump campaign members talked to Russian officials before the election, but he'll be able to talk about this or be Attorney General over this issue. And does that make you hopeful that we will see any kind of justice, knowing that Jeff Sessions is the Attorney General?
Wow. No. So I think that Jeff Sessions' history on race has been well documented, and I don't think it leaves folks who are hoping for the federal government to take a strong stance against racial hate crimes, that we can't be very optimistic if Jeff Sessions is leading this charge. We can't be very optimistic that we're going to get the outcome that we are hopeful for. If we are reliant upon if we're reliant upon Attorney General Sessions to make decisions about how this is going to be prosecuted, and whether or not federal hate crime charges are going to be brought against Adam Purinton, I think it's going to be an uphill battle to get this administration to see the graveness of this situation if it took this administration 6 days to even acknowledge and comment on it.
Yeah, what really got me is that Trump is into this divide of good immigrant versus bad dude immigrant, right? And Kuchibotla is really the good one, right? Coming to work from India to work at Garmin, 32. He's one of the young good ones that make him a lot more sympathetic. Trump with this good immigrant, bad immigrant thing, the Kuchibotla being a good immigrant and being shot and killed like this kind of really shines a light on just how tragic this, American xenophobic politics has become.
Right. And I also think that it highlights how artificial that kind of categorization really is. This administration is arguing that we should only allow in a certain kind of immigrant. The terminology that they like to use is merit-based visas, where we are granting visas to those who essentially prove that they belong in the country, and that we should turn away those that fail to prove that they belong in this country by some arbitrary standard. That, of course, does not reflect the real humanity of immigrants who are neither going to be quote unquote good or quote unquote bad. We're simply human. And it doesn't seem fair to place this sort of artificial categorization and standard of trying to prove our presence in the country or prove the validity of our presence in the country. And certainly something like what happened last week in Olathe demonstrates that even if you are on paper the quote unquote good immigrant, this administration and this system will not protect you. As far as this administration is concerned, they demonstrate by their inaction for nearly a week that they do not value the lives of any immigrants. What was very interesting is this was not a comment from Trump directly at the joint session, but from one of his spokespeople. But when his administration was first questioned about what happened in Olathe, one of the reporters asked for a comment and received back that the Trump administration denounces any crimes against the American people. Now, this was a very generic statement, but more importantly, it was a generic statement highlighting that the Trump administration was taking a stance to protect, quote unquote, the American people in an incident where 2 immigrants had been shot at. And so it demonstrates clearly that although the Trump administration is trying to draw a line around good immigrants versus bad immigrants. This is really lip service, because I think the really important line that the Trump administration is drawing is us versus them.
And that really struck me when here's the merit-based immigrant who gets shot because of a white American not really understanding anything about anything, but he had a gun and he used it. And that was how he chose to end debate, which, that's the state of America now. In the age of Trump, nuance is out. We have the nuance of a sledgehammer. And yeah, the joint speech was kind of a softer Trump. He tried to be soft, but I don't know if he's soft enough, but maybe soft enough to some of the people, who voted for him. So that kind of scares me a little bit because, his ratings were good and people are now, the fear I have is that people are going to normalize Trump, more than they have in the first 40 days. And unless there's some pushback from the community, we're going to have more of these kind of instances. That's my fear.
Well, I think that, my hope is that Americans who are listening to Trump will listen not to just how he's delivering his speech, but the substance of what he's saying. I agree that his address to the joint session was very much a tempered address in tone, and that he was, I think, attempting to be presidential in his style. But if you listened to what he was saying, he was offering the same kind of xenophobic and nativist rhetoric that he delivered with bombast on the campaign trail. The only difference between what he had said in front of the joint address and what he said in his campaign rallies was just the way that he said it. He wasn't telling people he would like to punch them or he was hoping someone would get punched in the face. But what he was saying was still criminalizing immigrants to a very alarming degree. In his joint session, he announced, for example, the creation of the Voice Office, and I don't remember off the top of my head the acronym. Right.
Victims of Immigrant Crime Enforcement or something.
That's impressive. I think you got it right.
Yeah, that acronym, E stands for engagement, Immigrant Crime Engagement.
Right.
And that really struck me because we should just have an office for victims of ICE, the actual police or the police force going into the workplaces and listening to people give speeches and then arresting them afterwards.
That's a fantastic point. I would much prefer that there was a victims of ICE office than the Voice Office that Trump announced. But that office is a really terrifying attempt to institutionalize the criminalization of immigrants by publishing lists of crimes committed by foreign-born individuals. That is the kind of tactic that one uses if one wants to create the perspective of a criminal community. And even though he delivered that to us in a very presidential style, that is the exact same kind of nativism that we came to expect from Donald Trump, the campaigner. And so my hope is that Americans will recognize that kind of nativist and un-American substance for what it is.
Now, one of the things that made me think of you to talk about this is because I was reading some writings in the Indian American community, and they were talking about, hey, this is, we can draw on the solidarity with Chinese Americans and bring up Vincent Chin. And we touched on that a little bit, but we also have to point out that, well, the important thing is that Vincent Chin, his case in 1982 was a rallying cry for all Asian Americans, and some people say the modern Asian American movement was created with the murder of Vincent Chin. Is this that kind of moment for Indian Americans too, or a greater solidarity moment for Asian Americans?
I'd like to hope so. I think that the parallel made to Vincent Chin has to be done cautiously because there are elements of this crime that are reminiscent of that and there are elements that are not. And I think it's very important not to erase the fact that this has been happening to the South Asian and Muslim American community much beyond what happened last week in Olathe. And I think that's important. When we draw the parallel to Vincent Chin, we do threaten to erase that. But if we are to make the parallel, and I do think that to some degree it's an apt parallel, what I do hope is that we draw the parallel insofar as we draw the parallel to how it became sort of a watershed moment for the Asian American community. I think you're absolutely right. It birthed the modern Asian American movement, and it did that by helping different communities that we now consider Asian American, but who at the time identified primarily by ethnic identifiers, so Chinese American communities and Japanese American communities, coming together across those ethnic boundaries and recognizing that racism really didn't recognize those ethnic differences. And so we, as different ethnicities of Asian American, had to find ways to work in solidarity with one another against a generalizing racism that would victimize all of us. I hope that what happened in Olathe manages to do the same thing.
We needed something in the Indian community to galvanize a feeling that, hey, we're not just good people, we're not just the good Indians, like the good Chinese or the good Asians, the model minority, because there's that tendency to react that way, to say, hey, look, we're good. We're the good immigrants, right? That's kind of like an offshoot of the model minority type of argument. But there is this now, this opportunity to stand up for all Indian Americans and all Asian Americans, as well as our Muslim brothers and sisters, and all those who are victimized because of their race or their beliefs.
Yeah, I think that this is a good opportunity. I think I agree that prior to this moment, unfortunately, it had been very difficult to convince many folks within the Asian American community that Islamophobia and nativism were issues that we should rally behind, that these were issues that affected us as a community. I think you're absolutely right to point out that there were many Asian Americans who were embracing the model minority myth and sort of imagining that they could bootstrap themselves out of this kind of racism. And I think that, or my hope is that in the weeks ahead, the Asian American community will have the kind of necessary conversations such as this one to hopefully come to the recognition and the realization that Islamophobia and nativism and xenophobia are sort of larger spectrums of racism that deeply impact South Asian Americans, East Asian Americans, and Southeast Asian Americans, and that we would do well to find solidarity and allyship with not only within the Asian American community, but also the Muslim community and other immigrant communities, and join forces and sort of take that spirit of what happened after Vincent Chin and revive that, and to sort of find the unifying rallying cry to push back against this kind of un-American hate.
Yeah, well, I really hope that you're right, but as we speak, I just saw something move on the wires about some poll that Fox News said, or that reported on, that said that people would just like to see all the Trump protesters move on. Right? There's that sentiment that, oh, he won the election, get over it, and these people see it on Facebook. They see it, in response to whatever they say about what's happening, about their protests. Their friends would come on and say, hey, why don't you, relax, take care, it's going to work out. It's going to be okay. I mean, to me, that's coming from the perspective of enemy of the people, that's what we have to fight against, the normalcy of these kind of transgressions.
Well, I think that kind of an attitude that folks who are protesting against Trump just need to kind of move along and start to live our lives, that is exactly what a lot of the Asian American community would like to be able to do, and that's exactly what Srinivas Kujibatla and Alok Madasani were doing. They were relaxing on a Wednesday evening, having a beer on a patio in a sports bar, when Trump's xenophobia and nativism sought them out and started to accuse them of being illegally in the country, and eventually committed violence against them. So we don't have the luxury of pretending as if this doesn't affect our daily lives, or that we can just sort of close it off and relax and just live our lives and sort of quote unquote get over it. Because as we were living our lives, we live our lives as people of color in this America. And whether we like it or not, the racism that has become normalized in Trump's America will seek us out and will, unfortunately, in the case of what happened last week in Olathe, take the lives of people in our community. And so we can't afford to not speak out against this kind of thing, because we don't have the choice to just live our lives and ignore it.
That's Jenn Fang, who writes the blog reappropriate.co, that's C-O. I talked to Jenn just a few weeks back, right when the Olathe, the Kuchibotla story broke, and I wanted to play it because it shows the concern of an Asian American who's very concerned about these things, and why it's time for all the rest of us, all the rest of Asian America, to take action and speak out against the Trump rhetoric. It's real. It's linked to violence against innocents. You can check out that SALT report, the new SALT report on hate crimes, which I have a link on the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund blog at aldef.org/blog. But it's clear that the rhetoric, the Trump rhetoric, must stop. There's another way we can stop terrorism, and it isn't through Islamophobia. And what's key is this rhetoric is important because we saw in the travel ban, in Judge Watson's decision on the travel ban 2.0, that what Trump said during the campaign trail comes back to bite. It stopped, essentially, travel ban 2.0. And that, folks, is our program for today. We're on iTunes. Please subscribe, rate, and review. You can contact me with your thoughts on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or go to the Aldef blog, www.aldef.org/blog. Give us your feedback. Thank you for listening. To Emil Amok's Takeout, I'm Emil Guillermo.